Hello and welcome to New Economic Thinking. Inequality has become an important policy preoccupation since 2008, but my next guest has been dealing with it for virtually his entire career as an economist. Professor Branko Milanovic, Professor of Economics at the City University of New York. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me, Marshall. It's a pleasure.
Now, you've been dealing with the subject of inequality since your days as a PhD student, which I won't say it's that far back, but it's certainly more than 7 years.
Well, it is quite far back, it's definitely in double digits.
Okay, but we won't go into a specific number. I think you mentioned to me that you were then a student in Yugoslavia,
Right.
which no longer exists, and then you went to Eastern Europe, and you were still studying inequality, and a lot of Eastern Europe no longer exists, at least in its current form, so I don't know what the implications are.
I moved on to studying global inequality. I was running out of topics.
So I should be reading my new books on the apocalypse, perhaps, and it is a result of that.
I hope no.
But it must be somewhat gratifying to you that it has become a respectable, quote unquote, subject, because of course you were considered to be an oddity, or at least a class warrior if you looked at this area pre-2008.
No, it's absolutely true. It was a kind of an underground topic. Everybody, of course, knew that inequality existed, and it was a topic. But it was very often put in development economics, as if it were really an issue only in developing countries. And it was generally really assumed away in modern macro or micro textbooks, because the assumption was essentially that factor shares would be constant, so capital and labor would get the same proportion of GDP. Then it was assumed that interpersonal inequality would be either constant or declining. And then it was assumed that if you really were interested in capital and ownership, really you should not be really worried about that, because these are endowments. And as you know, in micro models, we actually take endowments as given. So we really look at what happens after the agents already have their endowments. So really, to some extent, the topic was essentially assumed away in the kind of standard macro or micro texts.
But I remember first seeing you discuss it, because I had not been aware of your scholarship before 2009, when the Institute had its first conference. You linked it very closely to the emergence of financial bubbles and the aftermath, which in turn you argued expanded the inequalities. I always thought that in many respects that was a much more productive way of looking at it than saying, as far as the debate about capital rising inexorably regardless of what GDP was doing, because viscerally it just seems to me that you have a crash, the people that have the assets and the money can buy from the distressed sellers, so the next bubble comes along and the inequality expands.
It is actually something that came to somebody who studied inequality like myself, sort of a natural first explanation of the bubble and the crisis, because what we knew, and of course it was known, that you had a stagnation of middle-class income, stagnation of the median wage, and so on. On the other hand, the consumption of these households, as we know too, was rising faster than their incomes, partly because they were trying to compensate for the fact that actually their real incomes were not rising. And on the other hand, you had an incentive among the financial sector to lend, because every lending activity, every loan was actually for them more money. So you really had, one hand, need for keeping up with the Jones, if you want. And on the other hand, you have a need to find a placement for your capital. So it came to me, somebody who was actually working on inequality, as a natural way to look at the possibility that that might actually lead to the crisis. But the danger with that was that it was considered a little bit like under-consumptionist theory, which goes back, in the 19th century, was very much associated with left-wing views. I mean, John Hobson in 1904 actually put this up as an explanation for British imperialism, for example, saying that domestic consumption was not sufficient, so then basically capitalists in search of new markets had to go elsewhere. And then, of course, they would need state support in order to go to Africa or India or so on. So, that was a theory which existed, but then it was kind of forgotten.
It sounds actually quite credible, but was it the notion that it was linked so inexorably to imperialism that people had problems with? I mean, the causality actually seems quite credible to me.
It does actually, of course, it kind of got forgotten afterwards. Keynes brought it up a little bit, but Keynes was a little bit uncomfortable, I believe, in the general theory with implications that Hobbes had. Hobbes was actually against British imperialism because he was in favor of the British working class, because he saw that money which would actually go out of the UK as essentially money that could be used to employ British workers. So in that sense, it is interesting, some of the themes, I think, of globalization come back now 100 years later, because in a slightly different context, you can see that people who are against U.S., outsourcing or large investments abroad, they can say, from the trade union point of view, they can say, look, about that money, if it stayed in the U.S., that would be actually employing our workers, they would get better off, and instead it goes to India and employs, Indian workers. So it's really kind of a, it's difficult to say that one is right and the other is wrong, because it's actually Indian workers are very poor and they're very happy to have somebody who is going to employ them.
And so in many respects, you in theory, that should cause some diminution of the north-south inequality.
Absolutely. And that's actually interesting that you mentioned it, because in my work now on global inequality, which started in the late 90s, and there is clear now evidence that global inequality is definitely not on the rise, meaning inequality between all citizens in the world, and it's probably declining precisely because of very high rates of growth in China and India. And we are essentially seeing there people who started 20 years ago with very low incomes, very poor, not all of them obviously, but we're talking about the bulk of population. And then they gained, particularly in China, they tripled their incomes. And that created what we now call this sort of a global middle class, and then reduced global inequality. So, when you study inequality, I must say also you realize that there are really strong statements like this is good, this is bad, are never totally accurate, because something bad is often linked with something good.
Because in that specific example, you've effectively had a global wage arbitrage, which of course has benefited those workers in India and China, but of course people in the United States and Europe suffering. It's one way to explain the wage stagnation that we've had over the last 30 years in the West.
Absolutely. If you look at the data that actually the work that I did with Christoph Lackner, we had results for 25 years of by decile of income distribution for more than 100 countries. And what you find out there is actually there are three key points. One point is that you find people around the median of the world, which is not very much by Western standards, but where you have most of the Chinese population, they have gained very substantially. So you really have this peak. Then you go further and you find American or German lower middle class, and you see almost no growth in income. And then you come to the top 1% globally, and you see massive increases. So really, we see that really in the data, that actually that contrast or contradiction between the gains among relatively poor Indians and Chinese, and really absence of gains among the working class in rich countries.
Let me take a step back and ask you a more philosophical question. Is there something inexorable or inevitable about inequality, which seems to be one of the implications of Piketty's book, for example?
I'm actually currently, I have to say, actually, I'm finishing my own book on inequality. And I take a position that we may be now in what may be called the second Kuznets cycle. Or we might actually talk about Kuznets cycles rather than Kuznets curve, because I believe that with the second technological revolution that happened in the 1980s, we have entered a period of rising inequality. So it's because of the technological change, because of the rents which have been created, and because of the movement in the rich countries from manufacturing into services, which are much more heterogeneous in terms of wages. You have, investment bankers, and you have, people at McDonald's. So I don't think it's inexorable. I think that if I'm right, we are really on the upward rising portion of that Kuznets curve, but that is not going to go forever. So there is at some point that countervailing forces will be set in motion.
And do these countervailing forces come just naturally, or are there ways that we can adopt policies which would mitigate the inequality or mitigate the worst aspects of the Kuznets cycle?
You know, I think actually one of the maybe problems, somewhat of a problem with the original formulation is that actually formulation was for one curve, because that's basically what Kuznets saw. And I think now with 50 years of experience, of further knowledge, we might actually speak of cycles. But, you know, there are two elements there, I think, as you mentioned them. You know, one is first politics. But the politics is to a large extent endogenous. So if you have increased inequality, if you have stagnation of incomes, if you have a dissatisfaction with the, let's suppose, parties in power, then of course politics will respond to that. So there will be a change in policies, in principle, in democracies, but even in non-democracies. And then there are other forces, which are really forces which you can call maybe spontaneous forces of economic adjustment. So they will be countervailing forces. Is that actually some of the rents may be dissipated because you get them in the beginning, but then you start losing them because you have competitors who catch up with you. Then you can have actually also education levels catching up. So there are, I think, two forces. There are, I think, forces of policy and politics, which are somewhat endogenous to increase inequality, and then there are forces of spontaneous readjustment.
And as far as policy goes, if we do assume that inequality is a problem that must be addressed, what do you think is the best policy mix? Piketty talks about a global wealth tax. Are there specific policy ideas that you would have to address the issue, or is it unnecessary to do so?
You know, I think it is necessary, but I'm afraid, you know, none of us is very original on that, you know. People talk about education, about particularly early education, equality of opportunities. You know, it's very hard for anybody to be against, you know, equalization of opportunity. That's very, very clear. But then when you come to the real action, I read recently, for example, a very interesting study that shows the amount of tax expenditures that, for example, U.S. private universities get by not paying tax on their endowment, which turns out to be like, you know, $60,000 per student, whereas, of course, state funds their own public universities to the tune of $10,000 per student. So we know the problem exists. But is there political will? What do you do? I mean, are you going to start taxing endowments of the private universities? It's a very big political decision. Or you have other things, like obviously the minimum wage, which we know has been in the US like on the decline, and actually currently is lower than it was in 1968.
In real terms,
it's lower,
because
yeah.
it would have to be adjusted to something closer to $16, $17.
Right,
to
exactly.
equate to 1968.
Which is actually quite striking, because obviously the level of income in 1968 was probably at about 50% of what is now. And
we had a full employment economy, which does tend to cast a lie on the notion that somehow if you jack up the minimum wage, you create unemployment.
Absolutely. And you know, even 1968 was not a kind of oddity or a kind of a unique event, because actually when you look throughout the 50s and the 60s, it was still higher in real terms, obviously, than it is today. So that's another policy. So there are many other policies, of course, people have been talking about that, so it is nothing totally original. I don't think that all of them would really yield results immediately, because if you look at education, probably it would not yield results in another 10 years. But one has to start at some point.
What about, to go back to your point about financial bubbles, financialization and the increasing power of big finances seems to have played a very, very important role, both in terms of creating bubbles, speculation, and obviously the upshot being inequality. Surely there must be something we can do to downsize finance, as an example, and would that have a fairly significant impact on inequality?
You know, I've looked only at the data which actually show, of course, high participation of people who are linked with the financial sector in the top 1%. And there is also there an issue which we have not really yet solved, how we consider the incomes of such people. Because as you know, they are often linked, their salaries, they are actually officially labor income and their salaries, but they are linked to the performance, which is really practically very similar to the return from capital, because they get the percentage. So that's one issue, actually. Even we cannot be sure if these people are paid as capitalists or they're paid as workers. And certainly some kind of limits would be helpful for reducing inequality. But you know, it's also, as you know, a very difficult problem, particularly in the UK and the US, where the financial sector is very powerful. In the UK, it has also a geographical component because London, like New York, is a center not only for the United States or for the UK, but it's a center for the whole world and provides lots of jobs, attracts lots of money. So going after that is, I think, politically difficult.
Just to come back to a point you mentioned earlier, you talked about income versus capital. Which do you think is more important, income inequality or wealth inequality?
Oh, this is such a difficult question. It's almost
I
like
like asking difficult questions, especially
almost
to experts like you.
do you prefer your younger son or your older son? It's a very difficult question.
But it has implications, not to make a difficult question, but clearly different policy implications flow from which one you choose.
I would actually tend to be biased because I work on income inequality and to say income inequality. But I will refrain from being biased and I would say wealth inequality. And the reason is that actually if you equalize some way, wealth endowments, which means human capital and actually assets that you own and assets that you inherit, then thereby you have really equalized also incomes because, lots of our difference in income stems from really big differences in our endowment. And that endowment is not only money that maybe I got from, my parents, it's also a number of other things that they might have done for me to go to a fancy school, to have good connections that are very important. So in that sense, equalization of endowments, I would say, or capital is more important.
And specifically in the area of capital, you've done some work with this, and also Joe Stiglitz has done a lot, suggesting that the most important variable to isolate is land and the economic rents that flow from the ownership of land. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is actually a little bit interesting and ironic. It's actually when Piketty, of course, did his work, and he's still doing it, and there is a paper of his which is called The Return of Capital, because he really refocused our attention on capital. There were lots of work about wage inequality in the US and increasing the wage premium among the very highly skilled people and so on. But capital was a little bit forgotten. What was interesting is that what Stiglitz is now bringing in, to some extent, maybe stimulated by Piketty's work, is really the return of land.
So yes, land he dealt with that as early as 1965.
No, he did, exactly. Yeah. He did that like many years ago, but land became forgotten.
Yes.
It was like subsumed. It was believed like it was a factor of production from the 19th century. But now, because of housing, and because of the fact that actually we have, obviously land is limited, and number of people in my lifetime has gone from like 3 billion to 7. We have really had a huge increase in labor over land ratio, and maybe in great demand also for land, for better, housing, and then internationalization, as you know, of the real estate market and so on. So land is definitely back.
And leaving aside the political constraints which come with treating land in a very different way, I wonder whether some form, instead of talking about a global wealth tax, maybe a land tax is the kind of thing we should be focusing on. And the nice thing about land is it's not portable, so you can't avoid it. And if you say, for example, taxed on the basis of a land holding, or even a McMansion saying on the basis of square footage of a home, you would probably catch a lot of those people who would otherwise be able to avoid the tax.
That's true. That in the past you used to have, as you know, the tax on windows, and it was very hard actually to avoid the tax. Of course, the result was actually they built the houses with very few windows. But in this case, really, I think you would catch lots of people who are very rich and have really expensive property. It was, of course, going back to the idea that was like more than 100 years ago, Henry George had the idea of taxation of land because it was the least distortionary tax. If you tax income or consumption, obviously we changed our behavior. Land is essentially something that you can change your behavior on the margin, but it's basically something that is there. It's very visible, hard to hide. So you could tax it. So that's Stiglitz, I think, mentioned it the other day as a possibility.
Why do you think it hasn't been considered more? So again, is it purely politics, or is there some sort of economic flaw in the thinking behind taxing land?
Yeah, I honestly think, I'm not quite sure, but I honestly think that it was a little bit sort of disregarded because we were really in the world of labor and capital. And we were more and more into the world of labor and human capital, so-called human capital even more. Land really seemed like a sort of a throwback to the olden days, landed aristocracy and so on. And I think Piketty's contribution was very important because when you look at these graphs with, capital as capital over the GDP of the countries rising up, a lot of that is increase in land, which is basically increase in housing. So we knew obviously that there was a housing bubble and the prices of housing not only have risen in the US, but in Europe and elsewhere. But somehow it seemed to me, it was never somehow put together. So it is probably a mistake, an oversight of the profession.
So it's a classic illustration where new economic thinking might not be the right way to look at this. Sometimes it's reclaiming from the wisdom of the past. We've already mentioned people like Henry George, for example, and there's many more solutions we could perhaps still learn from the past in dealing with this problem. Branko Milanovic, it's a great pleasure to speak to you as always. Learn a lot whenever I speak to you about this subject, and I look forward to receiving your books, and hopefully we can have you on again and we can discuss it when it comes out. So
Thank you very much, Marshall. Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure. Thank you.